I'm so excited to welcome Hilary Pearson to the Phil Factor today. Hilary has a 20-year career in the field of foundation philanthropy in Canada. As the founding president of Philanthropic Foundations Canada from 2001 to 2019, she collaborated with many of the largest private charitable foundations in the country. She most recently the author of From Charity to Change, which is a fantastic book that takes an inside look at the world of Canadian foundations. It should be on your reading list if you work in this sector. I've had the pleasure of volunteering with Hilary, working with her in a consultancy capacity, and I'm privileged to call her a friend. Let's have a chat with Hilary and get her thoughts on how we're doing as a sector. Welcome, Hilary. Good to see you again.
Thank you very much, Kim. Great to see you too.
All right, so today we're going to dive into all things concerning the social sector and where we stand today and where we're going and where we're not going. And the first question that we're going to start off with is, why is the social sector not evolving as fast as it could be?
Yeah, well, that's a question that has a lot of dimensions to it. And I guess I'll start off by saying that when we talk about social sector, we have to differentiate between different players in the social sector, because I think the answer is that some are evolving fairly quickly and others are not at all. And so I think it's important to look at why there are some organizations in the sector that are really struggling, are having such a hard time. So broadly speaking, the social sector or the charitable sector or the nonprofit sector, however, broadly we want to call it, it's always had difficulty because it doesn't have a stable source of funding. I mean, that is the bottom line. And when you see parts of the sector doing better than other parts of the sector, it's usually because those parts have more stable funding. And for most of them, that means stable funding coming from either the government. So looking at universities, for example, who would certainly say at this point that they are struggling because their funding from government is not secure.
Especially if you're an Anglophone university in Quebec.
Yeah, absolutely. But, many universities in Ontario are really having a tough time. And I think we're going to be seeing, I think over this next couple of years, some very hard decisions being made by universities who had relatively good years, in the past sort of decade, but I think are now coming up against it with structural deficits, which is the kind of situation that many smaller organizations and businesses, I call them businesses, but organizations, sort of nonprofit or social purpose organizations. But typically the ones that have depended on government funding, and I would include health and health facilities, hospitals, et cetera, in that as well. They've also had some source of revenue from what one could call business activities. So universities have charged tuition to students. Hospitals and health facilities, not so much, of course, because we have Medicare, but there have been ancillary sources of revenue for these organizations.
They each have foundations that are dedicated to raising money for the hospitals. So
that's true too.
That's true too. But resources that most smaller nonprofits don't necessarily have.
That's true. That is true. And that is a gap. That is definitely a gap. But when I'm looking at these sources of revenue for the sector and the reason why some parts of the sector have had such a hard time evolving because of lack of funds, I'm looking at these three sources: government, business or business-like activity, and philanthropy as three different streams. And it's true that in all three streams, the larger organizations like the universities, the hospitals, museums, very large arts organizations, although I think they've had some trouble too, but they've been able to draw on all three of these sources of revenue in one way or another to be able to plan forward, to invest in themselves, to be able to develop their own capacity, to have staff, they can draw on resources. And a lot of the smaller organizations in the sector may not have stability in any of those sources of revenue, philanthropy, business, or government. And so they can't invest in themselves. They're keeping themselves afloat to deliver a program or a service or to pursue a mission, a social mission, and it's just not giving them enough revenue to be able to flourish as organizations.
So I also think that we see some really interesting waves of funding because of where the government chooses to prioritize, right? So
Yeah.
I know that on a municipal level and on a federal level, the issue with unhoused people is really top of mind for a lot of mayors, for a lot
Yeah.
of, the country. And so what we've seen is a larger injection in certain service area, nonprofit service areas,
Right.
like
Right.
shelters, or recently we've seen a lot more funding go the way of, supporting organizations that work to fight conjugal violence, because
Yeah.
after the
Yeah.
pandemic, there was a surge, or during the pandemic, there was a surge
Yeah.
of domestic violence issues and stuff like that. And so the government kind of sets the trend a bit about where they're
Yeah.
putting their priorities, and then the funding follows. And then
Yeah.
I see kind of like these shoo topics that we're like, wow, we're getting a lot of, even just like at Phil, we get a lot of requests from
Yeah.
certain types of organizations that kind of come in waves. And I
Right.
started thinking about that, and then I tied it back to who's holding the purse strings, and that big
Absolutely.
funder that you mentioned, the government, when they are focusing on certain areas of activities that they want to support, it
Right.
makes all the difference in the who can invest in capacity building and get
Right.
their, get a bit more on top of things.
Yeah, and another area that we could point to would be mental health, right?
Yeah.
For years, mental health was an under-resourced area. Youth mental health, for example, young people, getting access to services, children and youth, and dealing with illnesses that can be resolved. Not all mental illness can be resolved or fixed, or you can't recover from it. We still haven't got enough brain science to figure that one out. But there are many mental illnesses and disturbances that can be fixed, and especially if you intervene early. You would think there's a whole logic for funding to flow to youth mental health service providers, because the social impact, the social return on that investment, long run, more productive lives lived for longer in our
Mhm.
society, that would be absolutely an argument for the government and for everybody, all sources of funding, to invest in that area. But it was under-resourced for a long time. So, these choices that are being made, as you say, Kim, are they fluctuate, and the government picks winners and losers, I guess you could say. And broadly, all that adds up to, a pretty unstable situation for a lot of organizations in the social sector. So that's what's holding us back. And, I do want to say on this that, as I listen to people talk about kind of the state of the sector today, I hear a lot of talk about philanthropy, about donors, about trends in charitable giving. A lot of worrying and hand-wringing right now about the fact that fewer people are claiming tax, tax benefits, which means that maybe they're not giving as much. And you do see that sort of flatlining of revenue from donations from philanthropy more broadly. And there's also a change in the donor population, so that you have fewer dollars, but those fewer dollars are being given also in larger amounts by a smaller number of donors.
Yeah.
So older donors who have money and who are giving more money. And the rest of the population with, really stretched budgets are apparently, according to the data, are not giving as much.
Yeah,
Right?
Canada Helps had a report out saying that, that donations have been on the decline for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And I'm very involved in Giving Tuesday, the Giving Tuesday movement,
Right.
and we've been tracking
Right.
things, in Quebec and across Canada pretty carefully. And I think that I don't think that people are less generous. I just
No, I
think that
agree. Yeah.
there are new ways of contributing to society. If you think about crowdfunding, I
Mm.
have seen, we were talking about universities. I have seen university students mobilize their community
Yep.
to save, somebody who was about to be homeless because their apartment building burnt down and they lost everything, and they don't have clothes, they don't have books, they don't have a bed to
Right.
sleep in. And they will literally raise like $30,000 in a weekend
Yeah,
using
no, it's incredible.
crowdfunding, and
Yeah.
nobody could ever move that fast in a private foundation. Nobody could ever move that fast in another not-for-profit type of setting. But
Mhm.
crowdfunding has become this new, device for us to support things that we care about. And it's very spontaneous, and it really takes
Mhm.
off because of its the viral aspect of it and the
Right.
urgency of it, right?
Right. Right.
And
Yeah.
I think that some of the things that are holding our social sector back in general is that we're not innovating enough to keep up with how that next generation of donor wants to see its money collected, spent, invested, etc. So
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more going on than we know about. A lot of young people are
Yeah.
volunteering, but they're volunteering with their family. They're taking care of their grandma. They're taking things of these little things that we can't
Yeah.
quantify because it's
Yeah.
happening at a family level. They're caregivers for maybe somebody, in their family has a mental health issue and that they need to accompany them to appointments and
Right.
things like that. These are all
Right.
ways that we are doing things, but not being measured the same way. So I
No,
think,
I agree. And that goes back to my point, I think, on this, which is we put too much emphasis on the data that we are seeing that is essentially data coming from the government, from Canada Revenue Agency, which is very focused on understandably on the reporting that people are doing on their tax returns. Are they claiming tax credits or not? Are they saying that they've given or not in these tax returns? But that completely misses, as you say, a lot of the informal giving and mutual exchange that is happening in community. And I think that kind of mutual exchange has been going on forever. I think there's a very great book by Lucy Bernholtz from the United States called How We Give Now that I think that was written since the pandemic that really puts the spotlight on this kind of informal mutual exchange and aid and support and community-based giving that, I think is very true in Canada as well. Her examples are American examples, but I think we could do the same in Canada. So I think there is a base of support there for the work that many social sector organizations do. And it's why they persist, because even though they have these challenges, they are committed to mission, and they're populated often by people who really care about this work, are very motivated to do this work. It's not just a paycheck. So,
yeah.
in fact,
Yeah,
many
because we know
organizations.
because the paycheck's not that high.
Well, exactly, exactly. Yeah. And, I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think people in this sector should be underpaid, should not get benefits, should not have retirement, savings, should not be able to climb a ladder, within an organization. I think there are a lot of human resource issues in this sector that are quite troubling. And people stay because they care so much about what they're doing, and they do get a non-monetary satisfaction, I guess, from doing the work and helping others. So, in that sense, it's admirable. It's admirable to see the workforce in the social sector, but it's not admirable to see that people generally in our society would continue to accept that the conditions for people working in this sector would continue to be so poor.
I
So
don't
that
think they
goes in.
know. I don't think the outside world knows
Yeah.
much about how little our executive directors are being paid, or how some of them have to have a second job just to keep it, or they have many things on the go just to provide for their families and so on, or they work at
Yeah.
reduced hours because the organization can't pay them a full 40-week salary. And sometimes it's a job that's done by two people. And it's just like it's some really weird
Yeah.
combinations of things, which I think is a mystery to most donors and, regular folks who are outside the sector. And
Yeah.
then add to that there's probably a notion that if you work in the charitable sector, you should be
Yeah.
doing it for very
Yeah.
little or not
Right.
much, or that
Right.
whole notion of like, how the church used to support, all of the community's activities and did it without, asking for a penny kind of thing. And
Yeah.
so we're
Right.
carrying
Right.
this history in the sector that again feels like a lot of that needs to be shed, and there's a lot more
Hmm.
education to do, which is kind of a good segue to our next question, which is
Hmm.
what systemic issues are holding us back?
Mm. Well, and I think we started to touch on some of them. I'm really glad that we no longer call ourselves the voluntary sector, which we used to do 20 years
It's
ago, right?
true.
But that put the emphasis on volunteer. And to your point, it meant that one tended to think of this sector as being populated by volunteers. And if you call it the charitable sector, you immediately put into people's minds that association of charity with sacrifice and, doing it because you care about, the common good. And apparently that means that you're prepared to give up, a living to be able to do something for the common good. So I think that terms like that are now out of vogue, and I'm glad. But we haven't evolved in our thinking yet to the place where we can think of this sector as an economic sector in its own right. And by the word economic, I mean a sector that contributes employment, contributes GDP, contributes goods and services that have a value. The measures that we use, and this might be a systemic question, the measures that we use to quantify the value that's produced by this sector, I think are out of step, out of date. We
But
need
the
to
people
value.
who work in the sector don't know the stats. And so whenever
Yeah.
I get the opportunity to talk in front of charities and their board of directors, I say, we're part of a sector that represents 8.3% of the GDP. And they're like,
Mhm.
what? And then I'm like, yeah. And we have like billions of hours of volunteer time donated, and we employ 1.2 million people across Canada.
Right.
That's like 1 in 10 people work for a charity. Like if you do the math, that's
Right.
kind of astounding,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that there's so much money being circulated and creating and supporting all of these social services that we count on, that we think the government's got it all covered, but they don't. Like it's
No, they
really,
don't.
we don't even
Yeah.
call it an industry, we call it a sector.
Yeah.
Everybody else
Yeah.
calls himself an industry.
Yeah.
And I get
Yeah.
all riled up. I'm like, why don't we call ourselves an industry?
Yeah. I agree. So,
So
I think a lot of this has to be a kind of shift in mindset. Again, I think that's a kind of systemic issue. I think our mindset about the sector and how it operates and what its role is in the broader society and economy that we live in. That's a mindset that I think has to be modernized. You mentioned young people earlier, and I do think that young people of today, so current generation of people who are, say, 15 to 25 or 30, I think this may be a hope as much as it is a sort of something
request.
based on data.
Yeah.
But I do think that they are seeing this work differently, and that that might lead to a change in the way in which the sector is perceived. But I think back to, again, 20 years ago, and the effort that was being made by people in this sector to build awareness of the sector. And by awareness, they meant, again, that simply that understanding of how many people work here in this sector, how many people are contributing real substantive benefits to society, things that people didn't know. I remember Bob Wyatt from the Matart Foundation in Alberta, is famous for saying this, and he continues to say this, if we all in the social sector went on strike for a day, like all of us, down
Yeah.
tools, just quit, didn't do a thing, our society would come to a halt.
Yeah.
It would stop because of the labor that we are no longer performing, the contribution that we are no longer making. So there is that fundamental problem of how you create more awareness. But I think to answer your question about other sort of systemic issues beyond the I think, structural problem that we have in terms of accessing sustainable funding. We are, I think, starting to fall behind in the investment that we need to make in our technology support, digital technology in particular. And I think we're all looking at AI and how that might affect our sector and what we do with that. Is AI something that we should make a huge effort to try and understand and adapt into our organizations, or are we just simply going to be overwhelmed by the wave? And are many organizations going to go down because they can't keep up, or AI takes them out of business?
There's also the fact that, like, should we even be thinking that far forward to AI, even though it's being adopted in all the rest of the industries? But in my experience, working with small to medium-sized organizations, I just want to get them out of an Excel sheet and using a CRM. I just want them to migrate towards being able to take online donations in a really effective, efficient way. Like AI is like light years ahead compared to where some of these organizations are starting. And again, that comes kind of back to the systemic issue that I face every day, which is very few funders want to invest in the infrastructure, in the salaries, in the capacity building that these organizations so desperately need, which makes me scratch my head, because if I was a philanthropic foundation giving money to an organization that wasn't properly equipped, I would eventually feel like I'm giving good money after bad. So why wouldn't I invest in helping them get smarter tools, better technology, pay their people better, so that then the money will go further after that, And I think that that's a major mind shift that needs to change, because it's been hammered into donors for so long to, look at the administrative overhead. It shouldn't be, more than 10, 12%. We would never say that to a business. If I was trying to grow my business by 50%, or if if the demand for my services had grown by 30%, no board of directors would ever say, don't invest in marketing, don't invest in your people. Like, no, you hire people, you invest in your tools, and that's how you grow. And we don't have that mindset in this sector.
I agree. Yeah. And, again, that I think is part of what has to shift. And, speaking about funders, and that's sort of, I guess, the area that I know best in this sector, sort of looking at foundations and funders, I do see a mindset shift. I mentioned earlier that younger people think differently. And we are beginning to see a real generational change in philanthropy, and certainly in foundations. So as organizations, foundations are starting to hire people from a younger generation on the boards of many of these foundations. That you're seeing a younger generation arrive. So in a family foundation, for example, you might still see 3 generations represented, but the younger people, so again, people between the ages of, say, 20 and 35, are beginning to really take their place. And while I think this has yet to be proven, I don't say that right now this is a trend that's going to overtake everybody in the foundation sector. I wish it would, but I don't think it will. But I do see some signs of change. And I guess the way I would see it is, it's sort of a mindset that shifts from basically a transactional mindset to a relational mindset. And that has a lot of implications. If you think of your work as being a transaction, I'm sending a check to an organization, and I'm going to get them to give me a report on what they're doing. And it will be very much focused on that exchange of fund for report on results, without there being any kind of deeper relationship with the organization. Then you don't tend to think about investing in the organization. You're not thinking about the organization that you're funding as a partner, as a collaborator. And when you have that shift from basically funder recipient or grantor grantee, to use that language, you shift from that to partnership language. We're sitting around the table together and we're working on something that we all care about, and we care about the outcome that we're trying to achieve. And we're bringing different things to the table, with the funder bringing money and the organization bringing expertise and the capacity to deliver. If we can see that as a relationship, then I think it's more likely that the funder is going to start to invest in some of those capacity needs that you were mentioning earlier that have been neglected because they've been wrongly described as overhead, when in fact they're fundamentally important to the successful delivery of the program that the organization might be working on. So I think when you shift to that kind of mindset, when you think about relationship, you're also thinking your time horizon gets longer, because you're not just doing a simple one-off transaction. You're probably thinking about this more as a multi-year relationship. If you invest the time and the effort, you're not going to have it just for one short period of time or one project. You're going to want to invest over years. So from both a time perspective and also, and this is really important, I think, from a risk perspective, I think some funders, not all, but some funders are starting to think, maybe we can take more risk here. We trust this organization. We have a relationship with this organization. We know who they are. We trust the leadership of the organization. And so we're going to support something that is innovative, that maybe doesn't have a proof of concept, but maybe it's something that is going to really make a breakthrough in the social problem that we are working on together. So we're going to fund that, even though we're not sure how that's going to come out. And I think that deals with a big issue that many organizations have faced in the sector, which is this risk aversion on the part of funders of all kinds. Governments are very risk averse. They're the most risk averse in many ways. They're the biggest funder and the most risk averse ones. And, I think a lot of the social sector organizations that take money from government do it with an eye roll, because the accountability and the need to report back and the need to measure and the need to be super careful about the use of public funds makes it kind of stifles innovation. It makes it really difficult for an organization to be innovative, which means you don't advance, you don't progress, you don't change the problem that you're working on all that quickly.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, you've kind of started answering my third question, which is what do we need to change this slow evolution? And we talked about mindset from a couple of different levels, not only from the nonprofit standpoint, but also from the funders standpoint. And I think one of the frustrations that I hear from the organizations that we work with, especially when applying to corporate foundations or philanthropic foundations, is we don't know how to reach them. We don't know how to develop the relationship because the lights are off, the door is locked. I just saw Future of Good put out a report recently that said that only 40 some odd % of foundations have a website, right? So you can't even find them that easily. And organizations are turning to companies like mine to say, can you help me identify prospects and foundations and what could be my in? And we have, the research tools to do that, but a lot of them struggle to do it on their own. And then when you want to get a relationship started, you can't, because you can't phone call them, or they don't have the resources themselves. A lot of organizations don't even know that foundations are mostly volunteer led, and the board is just doing this, maybe meeting once a year to review applications, or maybe they meet 3 times a year, but they're certainly not checking their inbox and their voicemail every day like most organizations do, right? So there's all of this misunderstanding. And I remember giving a conference at PFC a few years ago where I told the foundations what it was like from a charity's perspective when applying to them for funding. And then a few weeks later, I went and gave a presentation to charities about what the realities are of running a foundation and how they make their decisions about giving out money. And both groups were completely shocked at what the other's reality was. And then they
Yeah.
started thinking, oh wow, this explains a lot. Like why don't I hear back? Why don't I get an answer? Will I ever
Right.
know? And all these things that the charities wonder when they kind of send out their applications into the void. They don't know what's going to happen
Yeah.
next. And now a lot of it is like the ones who do have websites insist that you pass by their portal to request the funding through the portal. So that, yes, it's efficient, but then it
Yeah.
counters what you were just saying about making it less transactional. It seems like now we're making it more transactional using technology in that way. So, I mean, how is a charity to even begin establishing a relationship with a funder if they just don't know how to get in?
I know it's tough. I agree. I think I want to come back to, the proportional contributions made by philanthropy versus government and then lines of revenue that come from selling services of various kinds. Philanthropy is never going to be the major source of funding for most organizations. So, I admit that many smaller organizations aren't successful at getting government money either, and they don't have too many services to sell. And frankly, that means they have to look at their business model because it's not then the job of philanthropy to rescue an organization that is fundamentally unviable. I think the sector and smaller organizations in the sector need to take a hard look at themselves. We apparently there has been a decrease in the number of charities that are registered in Canada. So, there've always been, if you take foundations out of the total, there have been about 75,000 registered charities kind of by and large over the past few years in Canada. CRA keeps track of all
Yeah.
these charities, of course. 75,000? I mean, it's hard to say, is that too many? Is that not enough? I would say when you look at the structure of the 75,000 and you see the thousands of very, very small charities that have a revenue of maybe $100,000 and are run entirely by volunteers, you have to wonder, are those charities, are they going to be viable long term? Or are they only there for a short period?
Or I'm
And what?
redundant because, oh, guess what? Down the street, there's an exact same
Yeah,
organization trying and
right,
struggling to do the exact same things that you're planning to do.
right.
We've seen, and I think it was there was a research done, and they had said that we're going to see more and more mergers and acquisitions within, the
Yeah,
nonprofit sector because charities just can't keep multiplying and hoping to get a smaller and smaller slice of the pie when it comes to
yeah,
funding, be it
right,
philanthropic or government
right.
money. Um, and I think what we're seeing, and you could probably validate this because you're closer to the funder side of things, but funders are now insisting that you are all
Mhm,
working towards, solving this, let's say, medical issue or,
mhm, mhm,
disease. I want you all to work on the project together to
mhm.
advance it, as opposed to me giving you 10,000, you 10,000, you 10,000. Here's 50. Go off
Right,
and work on something together. So
right.
if the people who are holding the purse strings are now kind of forcing this level of collaboration, I'm kind of happy about that. I don't know how you feel about it, but it makes a lot more sense to me
Oh, yeah.
because we should be having that collaborative nature in the sector.
Yeah, completely agree on that. Yeah. And I do think funders uh, can issue, for example, requests for proposals that incentivize organizations to work together. They can issue an RFP that says, basically, we're going to take collective proposals here. We would like to see a group of organizations working on a similar problem come together and give us a proposal. And that's an approach, for example, that was used by the Graham Beck Foundation here in Montreal years ago now, in working on this question of access for young people to mental health services.
Mhm.
So they wanted to make a systemic change in what they saw as being a very difficult situation for many young people who simply didn't know where to go, especially young people who are no longer in the pediatric system. So they might be 18, 19 years old, but they're very young still.
Yeah.
And they're adrift in an adult system and trying to negotiate their way through that system, trying to figure out where they can get help. That's very hard.
There's a gap there for that age group.
There's a big gap.
Yeah.
And what the Beck Foundation decided was that they were going to go at it with collective approaches. So they did that. They set up essentially it was a prize. They said, we're going to set up an amount of money, a significant amount of money, and we're going to ask groups of organizations who are working on this problem together. So people working directly with young people, people who were treatment providers, researchers, institutional research, people sort of in an institution that is a hospital, like the Douglas Hospital, for example, come together as a group and make a proposal to us. And we are not going to pick one of you. We are actually going to pick all of you. And you're going to work for a year with some money from us to develop your proposal, your approach to how you're going to improve access to youth mental health services. And we're, by the way, also going to bring you all together. And we're going to help you exchange with each other so that even if it's only one of you as a group that gets the ultimate award, we're going to help you all learn about different approaches. I mean, that is a way of advancing innovation in a field, I think, and also forcing that collaboration that otherwise is so difficult because I think, again, going back to systemic issues, institutional barriers to cooperation are huge.
Yeah.
Universities don't tend to cooperate with each other. Hospitals don't cooperate with each other as much as they should. Smaller organizations don't cooperate as much with each other as they should. And part of that is this idea that it's zero sum. The person or the organization that gets the money, if you don't get it, then that other person is getting it. We don't all win.
Yeah, survival of the fittest.
Right. And, that means that every organization keeps jealously guarding, what it can do and tries to differentiate itself from all others. But, I see this in the international development field. We have 3 terrific organizations in Canada, Plan, Care Canada, and Oxfam, will all say the same thing. If you put out their mission statement in a kind of blind test and you said, to people, okay, tell us which one of these organizations is which based on the mission statement, you wouldn't be able to, because all of them have got the right and same idea, which is we have to support women and girls in many emerging economies, because if you strengthen them, if you educate girls, if you protect women, if you give them employment opportunity, they are going to invest in their families and their communities, and everybody's going to be better off. That's totally right. That is a good logic model. But why do we
and
have
it's slowly
to
being proven too. Yeah.
Well, it is. But why are we having to choose as donors? Why can't we see kind of more collective effort on the part of organizations that have very similar missions?
Yeah. Well, I think that, my takeaways from this, I'm always looking for, hope in the sector. And, our company just celebrated 25 years, and I've been reflecting a lot on, what have I seen change in the last 25 years? And I think you've summed up quite a few of the pain points that I've witnessed, in the last couple of decades, which is, slow adoption on technology, not enough investment in certain areas, not enough collaboration on the charity side, but also not enough collaboration on the funder side. And so what I think I'm finding hopeful and what I'm taking away from our conversation today is that there are people who are recognizing that things have to change in this sector. Of course, none of it is happening at the pace that we need it to, especially when it comes to how, volatile the planet is right now, and how many injustices and inequalities there still are. But I think we spend a lot of time talking about the things that we're missing. And as a sector, we don't highlight and celebrate the things that we are achieving. And that was something that I took away also from a Canada Helps when they did their report on the sector. We had a panel, and the gentleman there was from an organization, and he said, we always look at, how bad things are in, I think the topic was children's mental health. And he's like, but what we're seeing, it was Kids Help Phone. That's what it was
Oh,
that
right,
organization. And he
right.
said,
Yeah.
we have a growing number of calls. We have the highest level of calls that we've ever seen before. And that's a good thing, because it
Mm.
means that people are asking for help. People are
Mhm.
speaking out on what they need, and they're coming forward, as
Mhm.
opposed to hiding in the shadows or being ashamed of their situations or what their needs are and stuff. And so I think what you were saying about that next generation is across the board. We're going to see next generation of funders that are going to be behaving differently, next generation of leadership from an executive director in a charity changing, and then the donor behavior is starting to change as well. But I
I
don't
think
think
so.
all those levels are talking to each other effectively right now. So hopefully whoever's watching this will kind of pick up on some things and maybe advocate for themselves a little bit more, or maybe pick up the phone and speak to their grantees and try to learn more about their situations, or just open those lines of communications, because
Yeah.
that's what I'm
Yeah.
hearing is that, if we're going to strengthen this sector and get through the next difficult few years, we
Mhm.
have to have better lines of communications. And so,
Oh, I
um,
agree. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, Kim. And I think you've summed it up well. I mean, I guess I also would want to leave with a message of optimism. There is more wealth in this country than there has ever been.
yeah,
We have seen progress on issues, on complex issues of poverty and homelessness and addiction and mental illness that we have not seen in forever. I think there is more understanding of the complexity of these issues, but also more willingness to step up. And I do think I see funders working together. I see funders talking to each other. I see more willingness to collaborate on these complex problems, and more urgency. The pandemic and the impact of climate change are both lending an urgency to this that I think will speed up the rate of change, the pace of change that we have seen. The shoots of hope, I guess, have been small and light green, but now they're really coming up. They're turning dark green, and I think there's a lot of really hopeful stuff happening in our sector.
yeah,
So
great. Well,
let's
thank you so
let's
much,
leave it on a
Hilary.
good note.
Yes, let's leave it on a good note, always on a high note. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me today, and
Thank you, Kim.
look forward to seeing you soon.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks very much.